So, going to be very different. I think I'm only going to mention working memory maybe 2 or 3 times. Um, so the goal of this experiment is going to be to use experimental syntax methodology to test the what is being called a peripheral phenomena of finiteness effects on adjunct islands. And what I hope to demonstrate is that, like other islands, adjunct islands are in fact subject to a finiteness manipulation. And I'm going to show that this is relevant only when extraction out of those adjuncts is involved. It's not a preference for non-finite adjuncts in general. And hopefully we'll see some importance of attending to such a small but robust effect. So we've known that finiteness has affected the acceptability of islands for a while. If we look at the WH violations in 1, what are you wondering whether to buy or not is preferred over what are you wondering whether I should buy or not. And similarly, in subject islands, the difference is the niece who being able to bake cookies for gives me great pleasure is not great, but better than the niece who that I can bake cookies for gives me great pleasure. Now, when we're talking about these finiteness manipulations, we're generally talking about things that are marginal versus unacceptable. So it's not the goal here to show that the finiteness manipulation is going to make things fabulous, just that there is a difference. But the claim has been that finiteness does not matter for adjunct islands. And adjunct islands, for the most part, have been taken to be uniformly unacceptable, regardless of finiteness. So both of the examples in 3 are deemed unacceptable, are ungrammatical. Who did Bill run after calling? Who did Bill run after he called? Right? You probably don't have any intuitions that one of these is better than the other. But I'm going to show through the experimental syntax methodology that there is actually a small but significant difference in this. Now, why does this small difference matter? Well, it depends on what type of approach you're coming from. In the grammatical literature, for example, the conditions on extractions domain has recently been challenged, at least partially, on the basis of the alleged fact of subject and adjunct islands behaving differently with respect to finiteness manipulations. Additionally, in the sentence processing literature, the apparent lack of influence of finiteness on adjuncts, where it influences other sentences apparently, has led researchers to concede that processing explanations may not be suitable for adjunct islands, kind of this idea of a taxonomy of islands that was mentioned earlier. So before we get into the specific finiteness manipulations, we might want to ask, well, can adjunct islands, these things that are largely taken to be terrible no matter what, can they be modulated at all? Well, if one assumes that relative clauses are a type of adjunct, then any type of modulation of a relative clause represents a modulation of at least a certain type of adjunct. So in 4a, if we compare "that's the campaign that I finally thought of someone to spearhead" to "that's the campaign that I finally thought of someone who could spearhead," there's an alleged distinction here, and this is actually a finiteness manipulation. In addition, Trustwell has an analysis of islands, specifically adjunct islands, as being event structure violations. And if the adjunct is such that the predicate and the adjunct can be understood as a single event, then extraction is permissible. So in 5a, what did John arrive whistling? Arrive whistling is perceived as one event. It's not that you arrived and then you whistled. It's one event that you're talking about. Similarly, in 5b, what are you working so hard in order to achieve? That whole working so hard in order to achieve something is understood as one event. So when this kind of interpretation is available, it seems that extraction out of islands is permissible. But can we modulate adjunct acceptability with finiteness in non-relative clause cases? So as we said before, both of these sentences are unacceptable. Who did Bill run after calling and who did Bill run after he called? And I'm not going to claim that a finiteness manipulation makes one of these great and the other remains terrible. there's going to be a very minor difference, however detectable, if we use the experimental syntax methodology, where these find gradations can sometimes be demonstrated, even if they're difficult for individual speakers to perceive. So this is the line that we're going to be approaching this from. We're going to do this in 3 experiments. So the first one, I'm going to show the influence of finiteness on judgments of extraction out of adjuncts. Then we're going to examine whether this finiteness effect modulates adjuncts themselves, or specifically extraction out of those adjuncts. And then in experiment 3, we're going to try to start some interpretation as to why this effect might be present by comparing finiteness effects in adjunct clauses with complement clauses. So, first, we're going to ask, does adjunct extraction vary with adjunct type? And in this first experiment, a variety of adjunct types were used. These are obviously the non-extracted versions of them, but we have things like the associative with, in order to clauses, non-finite temporal clauses, finite temporal clauses, and because clauses. And today we're going to focus in on the results for the non-finite temporal clause and the finite temporal clauses here. So in experiment 1, started with 208 UC San Diego undergrad students, and 19 of those had to be excluded due to either English not being their native language or not being their main language, which leads us with 189 subjects. Now the manipulations here are going to be a variety of verb types. So we're going to use 4 of the Dowdy-Wendler aspectual classes times those 5 adjunct types that I just showed you on the previous slide, with 1 example of each, 20 items and 40 fillers, and this is going to be on a 7-point Likert scale. So here are some sample materials. And so we can see, if we just look at this first block here, this is going to be with the with, extracting out of a with, and with a variety of type of aspectual verbs. Who did Bob run a mile with? Who did Bob start a race with? Who did Bob run with? Who is Bob a runner with? These various verbal types aren't going to play much of a role in the remainder of the talk, but just wanted to show that they are there, and also wanted to mention that they're very hard to build materials for. In a lot of the papers that deal with these types of things, the examples for the stative and the examples for the achievements just have nothing to do with each other. So as much as possible, we try to keep these in the same kind of general domain. So you can see these are all about running to some extent. So these are some sample materials. We'll jump right into the results. So there's a main effective adjunct type, and each of these adjunct types is successively significantly different from the next one. So extracting out of a with clause deems the most acceptable, followed by an in order to clause, then the temporal non-finite clause, the temporal finite clause, and the because clause. So the extraction out of with is basically accepted. The others are strongly degraded in comparison, but a gradient is definitely detectable. And if we look at this visually, we're going to see the ones that we're going to focus in on, these temporal non-finites and the temporal finites, with the preference being for the non-finite adjuncts, extraction out of those. I'd like to see that sentence written down. And just to show that these aren't being driven by any one type of verb class, we see this effect, this preference for the non-finite, extraction out of the non-finite adjuncts in the accomplishments, the achievements, and the activities. The statives were kind of at the bottom of everything. Nobody really liked any of the stative sentences, so we're leaving those out. So it's not terribly dependent on verb type, so we can say that adjunct extraction does vary with adjunct type. Specifically, for the purposes of the rest of this talk, there's a preference for extracting out of a non-finite temporal clause. Now, so what? Well, to the extent that any type of arguments have been made on the alleged lack of a finiteness effect for adjunct islands, those arguments don't really hold water. So trying to pull apart subjects and adjuncts in terms of arguing against the CED in this case isn't going to bear fruit, and saying that adjuncts are not applicable to a processing account due to a lack of a finiteness effect is also not fruitful. That is not to say that these types of statements are false. It's just that this is one argument among many from these positions that can't be sustained. So from here, we can ask, is this a non-finite preference for adjuncts in general or only for extraction out of adjuncts? And then eventually we're going to want to ask, why is there this non-finite preference? So in order to ask whether extraction is crucial, experiment 2 is going to compare extraction out of adjuncts using WH questions versus non-extraction yes-no question counterparts. So this is what the group looks like for this. We start with 241 students. For the same reasons, we have to pare down a few, and we end up with 220. And we're going to manipulate those two levels of question types, WH questions, which involve extraction, yes-no questions, which do not, with the two levels of finiteness, finite and non-finite, 24 items on a 7-point scale. So here are some sample materials here. So we have first on top the WH extraction questions, the non-finite and then the finite, and then we have their non-extraction counterparts. So for example, who did the carpenter restore the antique table after negotiating with? And half of these were accomplishments as shown above, and the other half were achievements. That doesn't bear anything on the results, just telling you what was there. So, the main question, is there a difference between whether there is extraction or not? So, looking at the statistical results, in the yes-no questions, there's no statistical effect, but there is a significant effect of finiteness in the WH extraction case. If we get a nice little picture, you can see that in the yes-no cases, things are rated higher. There's no island violation here because there's no extraction out of the island. But there's no difference between whether that island is finite or non-finite. However, in the extraction cases, these are rated much lower. They're island violations after all. But we do get an effect of a preference for non-finite, extracting out of non-finite adjuncts. So we have a small but statistically significant effect here. So no effect for yes-no questions and a significant effect for extraction out of with the WH questions. So is extraction crucial to this finiteness manipulation? Yes. So we can say that finiteness modulates the acceptability of, crucially, extraction out of an adjunct. It's not just a preference across the board for non-finite adjuncts as being more acceptable. So now we want to start delving into the why this finiteness effect might be present for the adjuncts and why it's present only in extraction situations. So one approach, going back to the idea of Trustwell earlier and being able to identify the adjunct with the predicate, does being non-finite somehow make it easier to do that identification? Obviously, these are not perfect identifications, otherwise they would be getting scores higher than a 2-point something or other. But is there some small additional benefit in this type of association? To test this, we're going to compare these with complement clauses, which by definition should already be identified with this verbal event, and they shouldn't need this distinction of finiteness or non-finiteness. So just to make this a little more explicit, we have alternating sets of predictions. So if extraction out of a non-finite clause is generally preferred, then the adjunct results are going to look just like the complement clause results. Namely, there's going to be a preference for extraction out of the non-finite cases. There's going to be a preference for the non-finite cases in extraction only. If there's no extraction, there should be no difference. Alternatively, if the preference for extracting out of non-finite adjunct clauses reflects a closer integration with the matrix clause, that integration is not needed with the complement clause, so the adjunct results and the complement clause results will not look the same. So, experiment 3 is so big that it can't fit on the screen. These are actually going to be the same 241 students. They're going to be they took experiments 2 and 3 simultaneously as fillers for each other with additions of other fillers. So the same 21 individuals are excluded. And we're going to manipulate question type, again, WH versus yes, no. Finiteness, again, finite, non-finite. And then the presence or absence of that. And this is going to be a little complicated. I'll explain this in a moment. And one item had to be removed from analysis due to an input error, which is fancy talk for a typo. So, what do these materials look like? Just like before, we have the extraction cases, the WH questions, and then their non-extraction counterparts, non-finite and finite. And that situation comes into play because Grant and I disagreed on whether or not this sentence should include that, whether the finite case should be what did the teacher report the students knew, or what did the teacher report that the students knew. So what we did was added an additional factor and did it both ways. Now, this complicates things slightly in that if that is included in an additional factor, it is not compatible with the non-finite cases. So if we have what did the teacher report that the students to know, just terrible, terrible, terrible. So when we look at the results, we're going to have to tease those things apart before we get to them. And just as a note, unlike the adjunct materials, the complements have an additional referent, the students, both in the finite and non-finite conditions. So here is the most complicated slide of the talk, and this is due to that issue with that. So what we're looking at here, in the left column are the finite cases, in the right column are the non-finite cases. The black solid line are the sentences that do not have that included. The red dotted line includes that. This is collapsed across question type, so this is both with extraction and without extraction. So if we look at these comparisons first, if we look at C versus D, the C sentence is the non-finite sentence types without that. So what did the teacher report the students to know? And this is rated as more acceptable as what did the teacher report that the students to know? This is not surprising because this sentence is terrible. Okay, so we've gotten that out of the way. Now, the A versus B comparison here, this is the question as to what does that do in the sentence. So the subjects preferred it with that in the sentence than without. However, the most interesting comparison for our purposes is going to be the B versus C comparison. So these are the sentences without that, whether it's finite or non-finite. So what did the teacher report the students knew versus what did the teacher report the students to know? And you can see a slight decline here. This actually turns out to be statistically significant, this difference, where there's a preference for the finite over the non-finite. Okay, so we have an effect of finiteness when we're looking at the sentences that don't include that. Now, if we included the sentences that include that, things get crazy. Actually, we'd have to exclude this, and then we would see that any difference from B to C would also be present in A to C. But for the purposes of the statistics, we're just looking at the comparison between, B and C. So this is what did the teacher report the students knew being preferred over what did the teacher report the students to know. So opposite the findings for the adjunct extraction, there's actually a small but significant preference for finite clauses over the non-finite clauses. And as I mentioned before, these results are collapsed over extraction. If we look at the differences in extraction, it just doesn't matter. So the clause complements prefer finite clauses rather than non-finite clauses, very small but significant, and do not care about extraction whatsoever. Now, looking at this, I can look at this and say, okay, no difference between the red line and the blue line. I'm happy with that. You might look at this and say, really? There's a difference between finite and non-finite? I wouldn't expect it just from looking at that picture either, but the statistics bear out. But more importantly, what I want to point out is that it just doesn't look anything like the adjunct clauses. Okay, so what we're seeing is in the complement clauses, there's no extraction penalty. The subjects did not care whether it was a WH question or a yes-no question, and they barely preferred finite over non-finite. This is in opposition to the adjunct classes where all extraction is penalized. We're extracting out of an island after all. But the non-finite is preferred over the finite only in the extraction case. So only in one case do we see this preference. And here we have the opposite preference. Even if you don't believe that it's the opposite preference, that's fine. Call it no preference. The generalization still holds. The complement clauses are not behaving like the adjunct clauses. So from our two predictions, we're going to go with the lower one. The preference for extracting out of a non-finite clause might reflect a closer integration with the matrix clause. So let's summarize. Experiment 1 showed that adjunct islands are in fact modulated by finiteness. And so any distinction between subject and adjunct islands, whether from a grammatical or processing view, can't rely on this alleged lack of finiteness effect in adjunct islands. It's there, it's just very small. And admittedly, they're both still ungrammatical. Now, finiteness is only modulating the attempts of extracting out of these adjuncts, and it's not a general preference. And additionally, complement clauses don't pattern like adjunct clauses with respect to finiteness, so it may be that non-finite adjuncts are more easily associated with the matrix verbs event structure. Obviously, this is just one possible approach among many. And we want to look more in detail at why there is this non-finite preference for extracting out of adjuncts and other islands, but not complements. What is it that being non-finite is getting for us? So one option is looking at the additional referent that occurs in the finite adjunct clauses here. So we're comparing who did the carpenter restore the antique table after he negotiated with versus who did the carpenter restore the antique table after negotiating with. So we have a confound here of not only a differentiation of tense marking on the verb, but also an additional lexical item and an additional referent here. This is not the case in the complement situation where they have the same number of reference and only differ in the verbal marking, but we don't see a distinction there. So it may be that this finiteness effect is actually due to this extra referent being present in this one case. This might be causing difficulties in associating with the matrix predicate. I don't want to claim that too strongly. I just want to point out that there's a confound between the tense marking and this additional referent. And this can be analyzed from any number of possible directions, whether it's an additional DP in the syntactic structure, an additional semantic or discourse reference, an additional processing burden, almost whatever flavor you prefer your island explanations to be in, this could matter for it. But it could still be that the verb being tensed or tenseless itself is driving some of this effect, although we don't see any clear evidence for this in the current study. So in future studies, we're going to want to try to tease apart these possible reasons for the finiteness effect. And one way that we could possibly do this is try to compare extraction from complements and adjuncts that are more similar to each other and see if we still get the similar patterns. And also manipulate the nature of this additional DP in these adjuncts, where we might change it from just a bare pronoun to something more complex, something more referential, and see if that starts pushing things in other directions. All of that is still to be done, but the basic point, the hopefully clear point, is that even though without experimental methodology, it doesn't look like there's a finiteness effect for islands. When we do the experiment and do the analysis, it is clearly there. Thank you.
It's really a clarification question.
Sure.
When we're comparing, say, a processing type of approach with a grammatical type of approach, and you say there is a finiteness effect because you find statistical significance in some differences in the judgments. My question, okay, they are statistically significant, but my question is whether we should give them significance when we are interpreting them. Because if you go for a grammatically based approach, we look at, or the series can explain absolute contrasts that don't exist in this kind of experiments, right? But still, although you have these very subtle differences, I mean, we're looking at very different domains of acceptability, right? So my question, and it's really clarification, is why should we care about some of the statistical significances you're finding?
So I think that is a great question, and I think basically what we want to do is kind of leave that open to the individual researchers. There's a strong debate going on, awfully a hotly contested debate, where there's one group saying, well, we don't need any type of experimental syntax. We can get what we need just from kind of traditional judgments. And there's another group that's saying, no, you have to do everything with these type of rigorous experimental methodologies. And I think that we would both claim that both of those views are a bit too strong and both make untenable claims. So I think that in the case that you are basing some of your argumentation on the claim that a distinction does or does not exist, it is probably worth your time to test it, especially if it is something that is potentially very subtle, that might not show up in kind of a traditional approach.
Well, I agree with what you're saying, but I think you always need a real person to interpret the data, right?
Of course.
And in some of the results you were showing, you were saying, well, this is very subtle, but it's statistically significant. So you're like waving things and say, well, the statistics is telling us everything, but I could say, well, but the difference between 2 and 4 in the acceptability rate is something I should care about. Between 2 and 2 plus 2.5, I don't want to care about, although it is statistically significant. You see what I mean?
Yes, I think it will definitely depend on the question you're asking, and also to what extent that those differences, whether it's from 2 to 4 or 2 to 2.5, are pairing up with other similar size differences that you're looking at. So I think it's largely a level of degree, which I think you're saying. Now, I would agree that it would seem silly to, say, base an entire syntactic theory on this type of distinction, right? If you ask a person on the street which one of these is better, if you give them the option, they're the same, a lot of people might say they're the same. So when you pull these apart experimentally, what you're getting is an insight into those subtle distinctions that may or may not be applicable to your theory, but they're things that I think are worth looking at and possibly troublesome to ignore.
Any more questions?
I just wanted to mention that there is a recent paper by Yoichi Miyamoto where he has cases showing that in Japanese you can extract from some adjunct in cases where they involve comparative structures and so on and so forth. And his analysis is based on the fact that you can extract whenever the adjunct enters into an agreement relation with aspect, following the analysis by McDonald and so on and so forth. And I also have a question related to the analysis of islands. In the case of temporal adjuncts that you have there, I was wondering, and according to some recent analysis, they would involve an operator, right, like a WH operator. And if that was the case, whether that would affect the results of your analysis or whether you would have to put them in relation to other structures like relative clauses or so on?
So the question is, if the analysis includes operators, would that make them more like relative clauses than bare adjuncts? Honestly, it's not something that we have directly thought of, but I would definitely entertain the possibility and we'll look at it.
A general question that it's related to a more specific one. General question is, did you have any specific reason to choose a 7-point scale over, say, magnitude estimation? And the specific, I mean, this is very naive, it's just, maybe it's totally stupid, but since in the discussion, this came up in the discussion in a previous talk, people may not want to use the 7-point thing for whatever reasons. Isn't it possible that you have a ceiling effect when you check for finiteness in adjuncts without extraction? So it was not 7, it was, I don't know, maybe 6 or something, I don't remember. But can you exclude that the lack of a difference between the two is a ceiling effect?
So first questions first. I have to say that the 7-point scale basically comes down to a personal preference. We have a recent WICFUL paper where we compare yes-no 7-point scale and magnitude estimation methodologies, and basically they're all good for the various purposes that they would be used for. So using the 7-point scale would essentially amounts to a personal preference. I don't think it would matter too much if it was done in one of the other methodologies. As far as the ceiling effect, it is a possibility. What I would want to do to check that, and I'm sorry I don't have this this data off the top of my head, is check for the fillers and see where the effect of kind of the effective range for these things is. Now, I had a discussion in the break where in the previous experiments, the results that I had were the same, whether they were 7-point scale or z-scores, whether they were normalized. That's true here. I didn't make a point out of it. I should have. But for whatever reason, the participants that we've been getting seem to be fairly comfortable using the full range of the scale. Now, I know I personally, when I'm doing these, I avoid 1s and 7 like the plague. Just a personal preference. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the subjects that we're getting. So I will definitely check into the ceiling effect, but I am not terribly concerned about it at this point.
So one last question, I think Klaus or...
Can you tell me a little bit more about the range of stimuli that you had for these temporal adjuncts? I mean, did you ever? So I guess I'm wondering about specifically about Rob Trustwell's claims about what is good and what is bad, and where you went there, and whether you have done or are going to check actually the ones that are supposed to be good. Because after he thinks is bad, and then he has these while and stuff that are supposed to be good. So what you showed after?
Right. So these are none of the adjuncts in here come close to approximating the ones that Trustwell has that he claims are just purely good. We're more or less trying to use his approach as kind of a framing of kind of seeing what might be going on. But we are not directly testing his types of sentences. Now, part of the motivation for doing the aspectual verbs was based on that. But that's not what we're focusing on here. If you would like to see the data for that, I can show you. It, not surprisingly, is a bit more complicated. And there are some interesting interactions between some of the aspectual verbs and some of these adjuncts. But we're working on getting towards those, but first we wanted to look at just kind of the basic plain, what you would think of as a normal temporal before, after, while type of adjunct.
But while behaves with after and before.
While,
are there contrasts between while?
Is that a statement or a question?
There was supposed to be question intonation. Is there a difference between after, before on the one hand and while on the other?
I am going to have to double check the materials for you on that. Unfortunately, with two talks in my head, I don't remember exactly whether while was included with after and before. But I can check on my laptop and tell you before the end of the day.
Thank you.